So, good evening to you all, and a very warm good morning to you in Melbourne. Dr. Miranda Eva Stanyon, our guest speaker tonight or this morning, it depends how we look at this from a globe's perspective. It is an absolute pleasure to have you with us. And I say this with fullest conviction because it is just about a year ago, is it not, that we presented under similar circumstances, and I think, however, you were by then already in Melbourne, back in Melbourne, we presented your wonderful study, Resounding the Sublime. And the ensuing discussion was truly invigorating, I have to say. And it was very appropriate that we should have presented your study at Queen Mary and also in the centre together with the English department, because after all, you hold your doctorate from Queen Mary, from where else, of course. Your career to date has already been extremely distinguished. I think this is certainly fair to say. You've been a junior research fellow at Christ College in Cambridge. You hold a lectureship in comparative literature at King's College. And you're now back in Melbourne on a Art Decra, I have to read this out, Art Decra research fellowship to conduct, and this is truly exciting, to conduct research on the romantic receptions of no less a person than Andromache. So how the Trojan War and how the Trojan female was received by romantics is your current research topic. But what we will hear from you today also takes up a very particular interest of yours in connection with your studies on Romanticism. Your topic today, the divided by a common tongue, Hoffmann and De Quincey on a European smash hit aria. That certainly links up with a remarkable, if I may say so, a remarkable article of yours on organ pipes and bodies with organs, listening to De Quincey's first Opium War essays. Again, a remarkable discovery in so many ways. And tonight, I'm sure we will get yet another one. It is appropriate that we should consider Hoffmann. Of course, it is the bicentenary of Hoffmann's death. And the connection between Hoffmann and De Quincey, there's not exactly a plethora of research on this. So yet again, I think we have you pioneering in this respect. And there is another publication which you co-edited, which I also would like to mention in this context. And it is music and the sonorous, that is to say, the sublime in European culture. So the sonorous sublime, the musical side, which is very much a particular interest of yours in the so-called long 18th century, as far as Anglo-German relations are concerned, and the, shall we say, equally long 19th century. Both is your, as it were, research ground, and the virtual floor is yours. Thank you so much, Miranda. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Rudiger. It's really wonderful to be here, and thank you so much for the invitation. This lecture, as you sort of hinted, owes its seeds, its origins to research during my doctorate. So it's a really particular pleasure to be invited to speak in the series and to acknowledge Rudiger's advice and support since that time. As I'm speaking from Melbourne, I also begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land where I work and speak from, the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people, and by paying my respects to their elders, past and present. My paper today forms a hinge between some past and present research for me. Earlier work on the musical sublime that you've just heard about, especially in the writing of the late Romantic author De Quincey, and my newer project on the Trojan woman Andromache. Well, how do these come together? Sometime in 1805, in the months preceding the death of Lord Nelson, a young student of classical languages and a self-taught student of German philosophy, Thomas De Quincey, developed a passion for opera and a passion for opium. These addictive substances were best enjoyed together, he later explained in Confessions of an English Opium Eater, which described his visits to the King's Theatre to hear Giuseppina Grassini pouring forth her passionate soul as, quote, Andromache at the tomb of Hector, etc. Well, that etc. in De Quincey's writing, evasive yet inviting, drew me in. This is a pretty rare mention by De Quincey of a specific singer and a specific role. Writing years later, almost 2 decades later in the Confessions, what might he expect readers to associate with Grassini, if anything? Why centre on her performances? And what was she singing? My attempts to answer this opened up a wider terrain than expected. Although Andromache is relatively little known today, across the long 18th century, an extensive repertoire surrounded this figure. She is, of course, the wife of the Trojan warrior Hector, later a slave and concubine of a Greek prince, later still the ruler of Buthrotum, visited by Aeneas during his travels. She's the mother of the endangered children Astyanax, heir to Troy, and in other versions, Molossus, a son by her captor, the mythic progenitors of various European kingdoms. In periods of imperiled succession, of war and displacement, Europeans frequently turned to this paradigmatic distressed mother, sentimental wife and widow, and patriotic exile, in music as in the visual arts, material culture, drama, and literature. As the musicologist Susanna Ograjenczek has noted, Andromache was in fact the tragic subject tackled by the largest number of 18th century composers. She surveys 41 new compositions and a number of revivals over the 18th century. And it's important to note that this only covers Italian language opera seria, a tradition crowned and concluded by Rossini's Andromache opera Ermione in 1819. In fact, if we look wider than this, there are over 300 sources of music on the Andromache myth from 1700 onwards. This repertoire features a number of Italian language cantatas, the most popular by Benedetto Marcello, drawing on a celebrated scene in Homer where Andromache unsuccessfully pleads with her husband not to leave Troy and enter battle. This parting of Andromache and Hector was also the subject for a group of lieder, at least 8 by the end of the Napoleonic period, by composers such as Johann Rudolf Zumsteeg, Johann Friedrich Reichardt, important for Hoffmann, Georg Christoph Großheim, Franz Xaver Kleinherz, and Franz Schubert in 1815. All these are settings of Schiller's Hector's Abschied, a dialogue poem which first appeared in Die Räuber in 1781, sung twice by Amalia von Edelreich, the apparently bereaved lover of Karl Moor. At least 3 French scenes, as they're styled, dramatized this same moment of parting, and there were several French language operas on the wider myth. So within this really huge and flexible repertoire, De Quincey's Andromache at the tomb of Hector, etc., seems like a needle in a haystack. But as I'll later discuss, Grassini's music is perhaps not even in the haystack of documented Andromache roles at all. My suggestion is that Grassini adapted for London music from a quite different but no less rich cultural network, not the neoclassical world of Andromache, but the aria Ombra Adorata with its Shakespearean heritage. Ombra Adorata was a smash hit on the opera market of revolutionary and Napoleonic era Europe. Like modern hits, it was covered by innumerable professional artists and amateurs. It first appeared in the Neapolitan composer Nicola Zingarelli's Romeo and Juliet in 1796. But the version which travelled so widely was already an interloper in this opera, a kind of improvement on Zingarelli's setting by the castrato Crescentini. Crescentini was the first Romeo, and Ombra Adorata is his character's swan song. Having drunk poison in the Capulet tomb, Romeo announces his last lament, Ultimo pianto, and in singing, he calls on his beloved to expect him in Elysium. Signorelli's opera travelled widely, from Vienna to Lisbon, Frankfurt, Paris, Vilnius, Moscow, Prague, London, New York, Buenos Aires, and further by 1826. But the aria, Ombra Adorata, was still better travelled. In performance, it was remixed, retexted, re-narrativized in settings ranging from new operas to domestic music making, vocal concerts, and instrumental arrangements. Textually, is represented not just in manuscripts and print scores, in private albums and singing manuals, in printed word books, but also in newspapers and periodicals, memoirs, autobiographies, reflective essays, and at least one novel and 2 novellas. It transported listeners through time and space, launched many careers, won a knighthood for its composer, Crescentini, made Napoleon weep, and starred in a parody devised by Empress Maria Theresa, where it was interrupted by a chorus of coughs, snores, and sneezes. It's a little cantata called Sick Beloved. This paper focuses, though, on just 3 textual appearances of the aria: Hoffmann's Ombra Adorata, first published in 1814, Stendhal's Life of Rossini, completed in 1823, and De Quincey's Confessions, 1821. I'll begin by orienting us with the aria. Here's the text by Giuseppe Foppo. Adored shade, wait, I will be invisible from you. In happy Elysium, my heart will be content. There, among faithful lovers, the delights of love await us. We will enjoy sweet moments of the most innocent feelings, and echo round about us will resound with love. Like many an aria text, this one is semantically very open. Its opening tag resonates with others in the Italian opera repertoire, including one of its own musical intertexts, Gluck's Orfeo, which I'll say a tiny bit about in a moment. So after Orfeo realizes he's lost Eurydice, he vows that nothing will divide him from his beloved and cries out, "M'aspetta, ombra adorata," wait for me, adored shade. The final lines of this aria look forward to sonic repetitions and variations, to a resonant Elysium where echo will make love resound. The text is, in a sense, brilliantly generic, undistinguished even, offering itself up to adaptations and associations. Similarly, Crescentini's music is on paper unassuming, even formulaic. Here's a piano reduction of just the first few lines. This major key melody here in D major is built from a few simple motifs with a B section that develops earlier material rather than presenting a really high contrast that we might be used to in many Italian arias of this period. The vocal line moves quite gently, especially in the opening phrases of each section. Somewhat more emphatic leaps do emerge as the aria unfolds, and written out elaborations of the opening motifs expand the compass and the flexibility of each phrase, leading the voice also up into a much brighter register. This reaches a climax in an extended high A above the stave, which then tumbles down in a written out melisma to a low C sharp on resound, followed by a final phrase circling around high F sharp, an octave above the opening that you can see here on the screen. So the singer leaves us on a high. The accompaniment, meanwhile, is regular, enlivened by a light, dripping staccato motif scored for violin and flute originally. The harmonic language is slow, unadventurous, with sparing dissonance. Hoffmann will just slightly exaggerate when he claims that the aria only used the tonic and the dominant. Now, we've found in testing this out that it's not possible to give you a good rendition or recording of the aria, but I can possibly point to a couple of recordings that we might add to the end of this. And it really is a piece that comes alive in performance, and it's very interesting to experiment with. But if we wanted to find an emblematically harmonious composition in this era, or an example of the sublime as noble simplicity, Crescentini's aria might fit the bill in its harmonic language, its melodic simplicity and cohesion, its even-tempered text. Yet this is, as it were, harmony out of place. Ombra adorata is meant to be the culmination of a tragedy. It's billed as Romeo's outpouring of grief, his last lament. And this disjunct didn't escape listeners. Stendhal at one point calls it, in effect, nothing but a sublime praise of suicide. While many listeners evidently found high pathos in this major key lament, a critic for the Allgemeine Musikalische Zeitung regretted that it was so sunny. The reception here is not dissimilar to that of Gluck's famous lament for Orfeo, Che farò senza Euridice. This is a piece Crescentini knew well, and Ombra adorata recalls some features of its melody, its accompaniment, and its major tonality. When some people complained to Gluck that his aria was too cheerful, the composer admitted that if the tempo and the singer's expression were just slightly wrong, the music, quote, would become a dance for marionettes. It was essentially and precariously malleable in Gluck's view. Well, to sum up the qualities of my aria and foreshadow some of my arguments, Ombra adorata's fame becomes comprehensible in light of this malleability and of three further features of Romantic era music culture. And here I'm drawing on and expanding the account of Ombra adorata in Martha Feldman's wonderful 2015 book on the castrato. So the first feature is a romantic preference, not universal, but a widespread romantic preference for singers with relatively simple and sentimental vocal profiles, whose powers were linked with natural pathos rather than learned vocal fireworks. But this didn't mean singing without ornaments. So second, we need to see Ombra adorata in the context of the supposedly natural, expressive, reined-in ornaments, which was still essential to the pathetic style and persona. Playing with the score here meant more than adding trills, divisions, and flourishes. It meant shifting tempi and dynamics, using legato or portamento to carry the voice between notes, deploying different timbres and strengths of the head voice and the chest voice, colouring the voice with breathiness, vibrato, trembling effects, using expressive breathing between notes to suggest sighing, sobbing, surprise, or determination. From this perspective, as Feldman points out, the aria was such stuff as singers' dreams are made on. Stendhal called these kinds of compositions canvases for the singer to work with. Hoffmann, speaking of Ombra adorata, calls it the lovely visage, the holdes Antlitz, heightened by glittering ornaments, glänzende Schmuck. A third feature, as Feldman and also the great critic Jean Starobinski found, is that the aria has very flexible potential as what Carolina Barte calls meta-song. It's a song thematizing resonance and echo, as I've mentioned. It's about transience and transcendence, supposed keynotes of music as a romantic medium. It describes desire for an absent beloved and a promise of future delight. We might think here of Stendhal's dictum that beauty is nothing but the promise of happiness. It's a swan song, lastly, by castrato, written as the era of the castrato drew to a close and during the death throes of an old political regime. Well, with all of this in mind, let's turn to Hoffmann's novella Ombra adorata, first published in the Fantasiestücke in Calouste Manière in 1814. It was most likely composed early in 1813 after the marriage of Julia Mark, a young singing student Hoffmann had idolized for several years, and apparently in connection with whom he twice wrote the cryptic phrase Ombra adorata in his diary. Like several Hoffmann tales, Ombra adorata doubles as music criticism, walking us through the experience of a particular event. In this case, a concert where Ombra adorata is performed by a female soprano and orchestra, matching the really masterful simplicity which the narrative values in this aria. The relationship between narrative and criticism or musical ekphrasis is really pared back. All we have is the narrator arriving at the theatre, thoroughly worn out, and relieved to find that a friend is taking over his own role at the keyboard, directing the concert. Also a relief is that the program has been changed from Beethoven's Fifth to some lighter fare. From here, the text closely follows the unfolding music via a paean to Crescentini as composer and original interpreter. This piece needs ornaments that are not on the page, he explains, but, quote, no one would dare introduce inappropriate flourishes, fremdartiger Schnörkel, in this piece, since Crescentini's manner, quote, has been handed down as though by a tradition. And the piece ends with an apostrophe to the singer, now at the time of writing absent, the singer from the concert. The apostrophe mimics the aria's own mode of address to an absent beloved. The narrator even takes a phrase from the recitative which precedes the aria, "I'm content, soon I will be with you, my life." And he turns this into a watchword about music to comfort him in evil days. The aria epitomizes the way that music can tear us, quote, above the pressure, the oppressive torture of earthly life, and grant us a, quote, new transfigured life, a glimpse of Elysium within this world. So it gives us ein neues, verklärtes Leben, which entreißt ihn schon hienieden dem Drange der niederdrückenden Qual des Irdischen. This self-reflexive use of the meta-song Ombra Adorata is quite explicit then, just as explicit as the theme of sort of musical enthusiasm. Yet the tale also provokes some questions. Ombra Adorata is the second item in the Kreisleriana within the Fantasiestücke. This set of initially 6 pieces evoked loosely the apprenticeship of the Kapellmeister Kreisler, including his musical suffering at the hands of Philistines, his lofty thoughts on the, quote, high value of music, a reprint of Hoffmann's review of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, Beethoven's Instrumentalmusik. These playful, passionate, opinionated fragments are only formally concluded in a later publication where another set of Kreisleriana ended with a Lehrbrief from Kreisler to himself, a letter of recommendation, telling the already professional music director that he had concluded his apprenticeship and was finally ready to begin the serious work of beginning his musical study. It's not clear then to what extent the Kreisleriana should be read as progressive or even sequential. As Kreisler's name hints, its parts go round in circles. So setting the very early piece, Ombra Adorata, in this larger framework, one could see the novella satirizing an immature response to music, which will later be corrected. One could even see the narrator's unbounded enthusiasm for Italian vocal music as a passion superseded by the pure instrumental music, famously praised in Beethoven's Instrumentalmusik. Yet any argument for a simple progress from Ombra Adorata is undermined, not least by that closing portrayal of Kreisler as an eternally fallible apprentice. What does seem clear is that the novella plays out a number of relationships, not only between music and listener, but between music and musician and music and verbal text. As is rather typical with Hoffmann, boundaries between the roles of performer, listener, and writer become blurred, partly because there's a low threshold here between music making and imagining, conceptualizing, or connecting with music in his schema. In the words of this story, music, quote, seems to live in the human breast itself. The person who responds to music, quote, is able to speak the language of that unknown romantic spirit realm unconsciously, like the apprentice who read aloud from his master's magic book. He calls forth all the apparitions from his interior so that they fly through life in shining dances and fill all who are able to see them with unending, unnameable longing. The listener's activity recalls that of the singer in this scenario, who is blessed with the ability to let what they receive deep inside them sound out bright and gloriously, hell und herrlich. Music here revolves around transmission and media transfer from inner experiences, which are also a kind of reading, to reading aloud, to creation of images or apparitions, to a seeing, which is also a listening. Hearing, of course, doesn't just mean being present in the concert hall. It means sharing a power or capacity for music with the musician, marked by a shared verb in the passages, vermag. We've already been told that this capacity means having music inside you, yet also knowing that it goes beyond you, that it's a mystery that fills you with Elysian longing, even while you're enjoying it. Well, the story ends, however, not with longing, but an unexpected moment of victory, a verbal inscription. After hammering home the ineffability of music and the evanescence of performance, "I will never hear you again," he mourns to the absent singer. The narrator immediately goes on to claim that he can capture music, and indeed the musician. Inspired by sound, he finds tones rising up, swirling and sparkling in his breast. And he concludes, I can grasp them, bind them, so that as if held together in a burst of fire or a sheaf of flames, they become a flaming image which transfigures and glorifies your song, you. In his commentary on this novella, David Charlton construes this closing moment as showing Kreisler's will to learn as a composer who early on can't write down his improvisations or who quickly destroys them. The sparks here are inspirations for musical writing, and the image, presumably, is a future musical composition. But I think the journey to musical composition is only one aspect of Hoffmann's tales, and I think a more straightforward construal of the image here, apparently achieved by the narrator, is that image we've just read, the image summoned up by the verbal text, which is and isn't ombra adorata. Song thus can become image, and image stand in for text. This transfiguration, Verklärung, parallels the ability of the sufferer who longingly followed music to then become a master and a bestower of gifts upon music. It's he who glorifies and transfigures what he's heard. These transformations rely on the translatable and translocal nature of music, according to the tale. Music from outside ultimately awakens tones lying inside the listener, and it's these internal tones which he grasps. Music making is thus an educative process in romantic fashion. Following De Quincey, we can say it educes or draws out powers already present in the apprentice, already suffusing his natural world. This is why even while music appears to be unearthly, it can be made manifest in the visible world when it's seen in a transfigured way. It's appropriate that this little drama is staged through ombra adorata. It combined first extreme transmissibility, including its ability apparently to transmit Crescentini's own manner, own style of singing. Secondly, a propensity to travel, which had made the aria ubiquitous. Hoffmann asks early on in his opening, how can I go back? His opening footnote, wer kennt nicht Crescentini's herrliche aria? Who doesn't know it? It's gone around the world almost by the time he's writing. And thirdly, ombra adorata has this really strong flexibility, its openness to new performers and new particularities of ornamentation and timbre. To my mind, all this moves the story away from a simple account of transcendence or romantic escapism, the sin of which Hoffmann's often accused. And the story looks less like some affirmation of ombra adorata as a kind of suicidal love-death exploration, one way of reading ombra adorata in the tradition. It seems instead to try to sketch out what makes music transformative in this world for a listener who admittedly longs to escape the world. Music is, in this reading, actuating common human capacities that empower the individual to make something in the world, the transfigured image, whatever that is. This in turn might be transmitted to others and transform their worlds. This looks almost like a liberatory or self-emancipatory model of art. It remains a very highly flawed one, relying on apostrophe's logic of replacement. The speaker replaces the absent singer, and a heroic masculine struggle to grasp and inscribe a vanished female voice. Nonetheless, it seems to me interesting to wonder about the tale's politics in the wake of more recent aesthetic thought, particularly Jacques Ranciere's politics of aesthetics, and even more so his emancipated spectator. Here, drawing on Schiller's aesthetic education and the Kantian aesthetic tradition, Rancière attempts to break down the hierarchy between actor and spectator, the distribution of active and passive roles that he argues still structures contemporary theatrical thought. He questions what he calls self-suppressing mediation in theatre, whereas mediation is in fact for him proper to the theatre world as it is to the rest of life. And he insists that the, quote, work of translation by the spectator is the first condition of any apprenticeship. Indeed, Rancière's recurrent figure of the aesthetic subject as an apprentice and the artist as ignorant schoolmaster has fascinating parallels with the figure of Kreisler, the ignorant Kapellmeister. And as an aside, this isn't so surprising when we think that the ignorant schoolmaster trope comes from Joseph Jacotot, an almost exact contemporary of Hoffmann's in France, or in fact in Dijon in Belgium and the French Empire. To quote Rancière a little further, and I'm not going to read out the whole of this, emancipation for him begins when we dismiss the opposition between looking, or we would say here, hearing, and acting, when we realize that hearing is also an action that confirms or modifies the distribution of the sensible with its implicit roles of domination and subjection. When we see that interpreting the world is already a means of transforming it, of reconfiguring it. The spectator is active, just like the student or scientist. He observes, he selects, he compares, he interprets. He makes his poem with the poem that is performed in front of him. She participates in the performance if she is able to tell her own story about the story that is in front of her, or if she is able to undo the performance. Well, despite Hoffmann's gestures towards immediate communion between listener, singer, and song, this will be a suppression of mediation, saying no, the singer, the song, and the musician can be one in performance. And despite his apparent subjection to his adored and inaccessibly lofty singer and song, still his grasping of creative energy in the form of sparks, his pointed use of the ekphrastic mode, that is, his creation from music of a story that is also his own story, to echo Rancière. All this suggests that emancipated mode that for Rancière coheres with the aesthetic regime. I'll return to these questions and to thinking a tiny bit about ekphrasis as a musical mode. But for now, a final note on Hoffmann's gendering of ombra adorata. The fact that Hoffmann heard a woman singing the aria around 1813 is not only a reflection of his gender ideology or his adoration of Julia Mark, and it's certainly not the case, as one critic assumes, that Hoffmann, quote, hides the fact that a castrato should be singing in his novella. Rather, the female voice reflects women's increasing takeover of castrati roles over the first decades of the 19th century. According to Alessandro de Bay's survey, a woman first played Signorelli's Romeo in 1800. That was Angelica Catalani. And very soon, the role was almost exclusively sung by women, with the exception of Crescentini himself. This leads me to my second case, to Stendhal. Writing about ombra adorata in the early 1820s in his Life of Rossini, Stendhal commemorated the fading voices of castrati as he glorified one of the best-known new Romeos, Giuditta Pasta. Pasta epitomized a school of singing seriously endangered, he thought, by machine-like brilliance, showiness, and homogeneity. Her appeal lay partly in her delicate voice and changeable timbre over her range. These strengths, when it came to expressivity and pathos, were also strategic weaknesses, vulnerabilities that cried out for protection. The simplicity and pathos of ombra adorata, alongside its theme of loss, give it a strategic role in the Life of Rossini. Hearing Pasta perform the piece, Stendhal claims, Rossini might be inspired to return to the, quote, simple, expressive melodies with which he first began his career of glory. Stendhal quotes at length the impressions of a friend, styled as an exile from Naples, then under Bourbon rule following the Austro-Neapolitan War of 1815. As Romeo, Pasta's timbres, sometimes veiled when she sang them in her chest voice, sometimes clear when she sang the same notes in her head voice, are transportative, taking the friend back to his unhappy homeland, seen in a particular light and in particular moments of the year. We get an image of autumn, an image of the moon intermittently covered by clouds, of the sea scintillating under the changing light. Pasta's secrets in calling up this kind of memory derive from her castrato forebears, the originators of this vocal ideal. Castrati, such as Crescentini and Velluti, knew how to make this same melody express not just high passion, but according to Stendhal, very varying passions. Do I have a yes? When Crescentini sang ombra adorata, he gave such a shade of spontaneous feeling to the varied inflections of his voice as the impulses of the moment called forth. It appeared at the instant he was singing it that such ought to be the sentiment of an impassioned lover who was about to rejoin the object of his affections, Juliet, of course. Velluti gave the aria another shade of feeling, making it a melancholic and pensive reflection. No master for Stendhal could ever paint those innumerable and delicately varied shades which form the perfection of Crescentini's manner, shades that are infinitely diversified according to the state of the singer's voice or his degree of illusion or enthusiasm. So perfection in singing for Stendhal demands that a singer yield to the inspirations of the moment. Not unlike Hoffmann, then, Stendhal is stressing the aria's movability, its ability to move listeners' feelings, but also to transport them from the present to the particular texture of another time and place. And finally, its susceptibility to interpretation in this passage you've seen here, shifting from one affect to another in the hands of great singers, unlike the possibilities for the tightly regimented and prescribed music of Rossini's second style, his current modern style that Stendhal is juxtaposing with this aria. Rossini is a genial composer who inaugurated a musical revolution, as Stendhal explicitly calls it, but this revolution has become misguidedly authoritarian. For, quote, it is impossible for a master, that is a composer, to be acquainted with all the resources of a singer's voice, which can be known only to the possessor, who spent 20 years of his life forming it and studying its powers. Let an ornament be executed feebly, without spirit, and its charm is instantaneously destroyed. You are in heaven, and in an instant you find yourself in a box of the opera. Nay, what is worse, perhaps in the midst of a singing school. There's a clear political parallel subtext in Stendhal's treatment of Rossini. Rossini's worldwide reign followed that of Napoleon, Stendhal notes in the opening, and so coincided with the rise in France and Naples of retrograde authoritarian monarchies. It was the fall of Napoleon which drove the Republican Stendhal to Italy, he claims, where he gained the credentials to write the Rossini's life in the first place. A few years after he'd written this text in his novel, The Red and the Black, Stendhal called the age a century of boredom, famously, where no one dared to show any vivacity, any spontaneity or independence. In the salons of Restoration Paris, quote, fearful of talking about anything which might arouse the suspicion that they were thinking, people fell silent after one or two elegant remarks about Rossini and the weather. So Rossini receives high praise from Stendhal in the life, but his portrait is nonetheless deeply ambivalent, something that's sometimes lost in the scholarship, I think. The true heroes of the text are larger than life performers, virtuosi not only thanks to their arduous technical training, but thanks to kind of heroic subjectivities, their knowledge of their own feelings and powers, leading them to spontaneous feats of interpretation. Ombra adorata in this context becomes an emblem of a political and aesthetic kind. It's an aria which requires a degree of equality between composer, performer, and even listener. The listeners, like Stendhal, remained free both to praise and blame composer, in fact, to move mercurially from one to the other. And more importantly, an ideal of spontaneity requiring freedom of movement. Anything else takes us from Elysium to the schoolroom, the realm of the bored, or in Rancière's words, the stultified student. Interestingly, in the English version of the life, published very early in 1824, and that's the text that I've shown you here, Stendhal's account of Ombra adorata is dotted with the word shade. So a shade of spontaneous feeling, another shade of feeling, delicately varied shades, shades that are infinitely diversified. This repeated term partly serves to kind of vague out over the particularities of Stendhal's phrasing. It's not hugely precise. The word shade is not foregrounded in the French, but ironically, it also evokes not just vagueness, but the uncapturable specificity of voice, the manifold modifications of vocal colour, so valued by Stendhal. Finally, the term is another example, at the minute level of diction, of the aria's propensity to act as meta-song, with Romeo's adored shade of Juliet bleeding over into the adored shades of feeling and of vocal timbre that Stendhal loves and misses in the new music. Well, this theme of nostalgia and memory brings me to De Quincey and his vocal ideal, Giuseppina Grassini. Like Pasta, less famous, she was a contralto who traded partly on her vocal vulnerabilities. Grassini's appearances as Andromache at the King's Theatre are pretty well documented. She first performed what's called a grand scene alone while the rest of the company was staging a full opera for a benefit night. Newspapers advertised this interlude as written for Grassini by the famous composer Zingarelli. Zingarelli, however, left no traces of a vocal work where Andromache mourns Hector, nor is it evident from my research that Grassini performed as Andromache elsewhere, but she did have a strong connection with Zingarelli, having created the role of Juliet opposite Crescentini in 1796. She was later with the castrato Crescentini in Paris, reportedly as Napoleon's lover, as well as his favourite female singer, the favourite male being Crescentini, until she joined the King's Theatre in London for a few seasons around 1804. And Grassini repeatedly did use Ombra Adorata as a suitcase aria, inserting it into other operas and wheeling it out for concerts. One preserved score, now held in Cologne, indicates how Grassini adapted the part of Romeo to suit a widow. So a number of women at this time will simply use Romeo's text and sing as if the context is not important or perform in pants roles, but Grassini really doesn't tend to do this at all. So what she does is to fillet the whole final act of Romeo and Juliet by Zingarelli to form a new scene comprising a long, dark C minor cavatina that had been composed by Zingarelli, but shorn of its original chorus interjections. A widow enters the tomb and sees the urn of her spouse and laments his horrible fate. Skipping a few numbers from the original, she then shifts gear into D major for Ombra Adorata as Crescentini had written it. Word books show that Grassini also inserted this whole longer scene into her portrayals of Cleopatra, Mourning for Mark Antony, both in a full-length opera and in later concerts where she appeared in various roles in freestanding scenes. And she really lent into this idea of appearing in character that's popular in the Romantic era. Now, in Napoleonic era London, where Grassini was a somewhat suspect newcomer, she was known to have been the lover of Napoleon, and she was understood to be a rival to an English prima donna, Elizabeth Billington. Andromache would have been a really canny choice for an in-character performance of this Zingarelli Crescentini material, preferable for Grassini's purposes to appearing again as the scandalous Cleopatra or as a cross-dressing Romeo, who might point back to Crescentini in Paris and to the world of the castrati, at that moment absent from the English opera stage, already falling from favour there. Andromache was, after all, a familiar paragon of sentimental, patriotic devotion. Whatever Grassini sang, Ombra Adorata represents the kind of repertoire she really favoured. She was one of those pathos-filled, less acrobatic performers for whom this aria was so successful. Grassini's reputed rivalry with Elizabeth Billington indeed echoed the opposition of pathos to brilliance that was used to set different singers against each other, different castrati against each other on the continent. Her voice in London was sometimes called weak and uneven. Some people said she'd had an accident, but her scene as Andromache was credited with, quote, pathetic powers. One listener called her sublimely pathetic, and a fashionable magazine complained that, quote, Grassini had pathos indeed, but she was always pathetic, unable to divest her voice, her looks, or her action of that air of affliction or melancholy dignity which she so finely personified, end quote. With this in mind, here's De Quincey's brief evocation of Grassini's appearances as Andromache. When Grassini appeared in some interlude, as she often did, and she repeated this Andromache scene, and poured forth her passionate soul as Andromache at the tomb of Hector, etc., I question whether any Turk of all that ever entered the paradise of opium eaters can have had half the pleasure I had. A chorus, etc., of elaborate harmony displayed before me, as in a piece of arras work, the whole of my past life, not as if recalled by an act of memory, but as if present and incarnated in the music, no longer painful to dwell upon, but the detail of its incidents removed or blended in some hazy abstraction, and its passions exalted, spiritualized, and sublimed. This comes near the climax of De Quincey's demonstration of the pleasures of opium. It's helping him to present those pleasures as if they're kind of essentially aesthetic, in the sense that they mediate between immediate sensuous perceptions, which are also accessible as pleasure to torpid, stultified barbarians like the Turks. And on the other hand, the enthusiastic, purely spiritual pleasures claimed by some mystics, by hermits, or by other antiquated escapists. De Quincey doesn't want opium eating to be that kind of escapist pleasure that cuts you off from the world. So opium is claimed to stimulate our active processing of physical perception. Here, perceptions of harmony, which De Quincey argues in the longer passage, is created by the mind, not by the ear. We're not passive to musical impressions. And we might compare here Hoffmann's presentation of music as an active form of listening and participation. Opium eating also escapes the charge of making its consumers antisocial or misanthropic, because De Quincey wants to show us that it gels with attending a busy opera house. Finally, music makes opium eating seem redemptive in the manner of aesthetic experiences like the post-Kantian sublime. In a move familiar from Hoffmann and Stendhal, music in this scene becomes an image graspable as a whole, or it raises an image graspable as a whole, a piece of arras work, tapestry. For the reader, this image is not just something woven like a textile, but can only appear as text, though we may be tacitly expected to form our own images to supply musical et ceteras and memories of our own. So where Stendhal's friend finds a lost homeland in Pasta's voice and creates a quite incredibly transportative image of that homeland for Stendhal, and while Hoffmann's narrator finds a better life in his singer's call to Elysium and creates his own image of the singer, De Quincey has his entire life given back to him by music, as if it were an aesthetic whole. Music gives De Quincey a sequence of disparate experiences, incidents, pains, back in the shape of something unified, subliming his passions to let him take an apparently disinterested pleasure in his own former sufferings. More than purely a meta song, a self-referential song about music, we're offered a meta-aesthetic experience in Grassini's presentation of loss transformed into resonating harmony. And again, I think the text and the musical details of Ombra Adorata sit really resonantly behind this kind of, behind De Quincey's explanation. I shouldn't say his explanation, I should say his musical ekphrasis, his description of his pleasures. So De Quincey's Confessions appeared serially in 1821, just a few years before Stendhal's Life of Rossini, a few years before Rossini visited England in late 1823, and a couple of years before De Quincey's explicit mention of Hoffmann's Fantasiestücke in an 1826 review. Here, De Quincey portrayed Hoffmann as basically wild, bizarre scribbler, though not without all merit. But there are numerous intriguing parallels between these two writers, as I'm not the first to sense. Their tastes for altered states and addictive substances, their hazy interests in German philosophy, their secret interests in secret murder, which De Quincey points out, their deployments of the Anglo-German figures of arabesque and serpentine line. And Jean-Paul famously argued that Hoffmann's Fantasiestücke in Callot's manière, fantasies after the French artist Callot, should instead be called fantasies after the English artist Hogarth, the key theorist of the serpentine line. And that's by the by. The parallels extend to Hoffmann and De Quincey's status as what could be called canonically minor late romantics, to follow Margaret Russett's characterization of De Quincey as a canonical minority, being the space that he inhabits. And Hoffmann inhabits something of the same cultural space for us as readers, I think. De Quincey's interest in music is much less prominent and much less knowledgeable than Hoffmann's, but a passion for Ombra Adorata may form another unexpected convergence between them, an Anglo-German connection built from multiple twisted threads from a much wider transnational musical and literary culture. And I'll leave it there. Thank you very much for your time.
Miranda Stanyon, thank you ever so much for your exploration of an aria which you presented to us as, shall we say, a resounding common denominator between writers who shared one elective affinity. And I think Ombra Adorata is that affinity, which you have made so clear. The floor is open for discussion, for questions, and I think the idea is for you to use the chat. Should you like to be promoted to co-host, Jana will do that, and you would then be able to speak. Alternatively, we have the chat function open. Let me just see whether, yeah, that is also Jana's comment just now. Thank you for that. Whilst you might be thinking about particular questions and thoughts, one can't help thinking, can one, Miranda, that Ombra Adorata, Aspetta, seems to also have something of Ombra Mai Fu. That is to say, a kind of post-Hendelian response, so to speak. Less complex in terms of composition, quite clearly, but the pathos is there, and there is something perhaps post-Hendelian here. Isn't that the case? I mean, it is interesting, is it not, that you mentioned Rossini, and Stendhal's biography. He is one of the pioneers of musical biography. Apart from Vogel, there is precious little in terms of a biography of a composer. Crusander, however, with the Handel biography, is also quite close in all of that. But back to the actual question, is there any trace? Have you found anything that might point back to Ombra Mai Fu?
Look, I've often thought about Ombra Mai Fu and of Ombra Cara, the one of Handel's other arias in connection with this. I mean, I think that it certainly belongs to it would be really fascinating to properly sketch out the musical qualities of a kind of subgenre of major key things that at least are received as sort of major key laments, and I think Ombra Mai Fu would sit there. Things that sort of, when you recall them, I think listeners would hesitate about what their effective kind of charge is, and I don't know about the it would be great to follow that through from Handel to Gluck, and from Gluck, which I think is the real key musical intertext for Crescentini. You wouldn't be surprised to see those connections. And Crescentini certainly, while 1796 is very late, it it sits in a real kind of Sattelzeit between sort of Metastasian opera and sort of romantic opera, which is partly why it can sustain its popularity for so long. And the kind of the simplicity that people like Burney value in some of Handel's work, I think resonates with Ombra Mai Fu. That's the part of obviously part of the romantic appreciation for Handel in the late 18th century is for glorious, full, loud, complex, overwhelming presentations of things like the Messiah in the Westminster celebrations. But the other side is that that sense of simplicity, clarity, line, vocal power that the Romantics sort of focus on with Handel.
Thank you. I mean, since we are talking about shadows here in many ways, would you argue that to a certain extent, the way in which Hoffmann writes about Ombra Adorata somehow also points towards foreshadows what he himself is doing in after all, what is basically the first romantic opera, namely his Undine. I wouldn't say that the shadow is most prominent in Undine, but to a certain extent, it's a different kind of shadow that we're dealing with here as well. And you quite rightly use the word musical ekphrasis. I pricked up my ears when you mentioned this. I think it's absolutely true. We are talking about describing sound, music in the shape of a picture. It's a kind of resounding picture. And that, however, is something that we have also in Undine very prominently. Would you say there is a connection between this approach to the novella and what he then does as an opera composer?
That's a brilliant question, and it's basically one that I should just go away and think about much harder and much more fully. I mean, I think others have seen connections in the from the sort of Julia Mark experience and thematic through Opera Rata and through into the later writing, musical and literary, and so that's certainly one way of following that trajectory, and the themes I've talked about in Opera Rata are so recurrent, so pervasive in the writings about that sort of dialectic or paradox between longing for something and holding and having something, simply receiving something and creating something. It's such a sort of it's such a continuous attempt to render something that you would be surprised if it were not there in later compositions. And sort of in terms of musical style, certainly Ombra Adorata, the Italian vocal music of this the kind of older school, with what Hoffmann saw as a kind of perfection of melodic composition, is something that he seems to have striven for and to have found quite elusive in terms of his own ability to forge melodies.
Yeah.
So sorry, that's not a very direct answer, but I suppose those are the directions that you might be looking.
Thank you for that. Yes. Ladies and gentlemen, any questions? Ricarda, Ricarda, please.
I'm unmuted, I hope now. Can you hear me?
We can hear you, yes.
Thank you very much, Miranda. I loved your lecture very much. It was really stimulating. I'm particularly interested in Hoffmann, as you may know, and I was very pleased to hear that you defended him against the accusation of gender stereotyping. But I was also wondering if you might comment on how he presents romantic music here in The Voice, and in the Beethoven review, where he says instrumental music is the only real romantic music. How do you see those two relating to each other?
Thank you very much, Ricarda. That's a kind of blind spot in my paper. I mentioned the Beethoven's Instrumentalmusik, but not explicitly how it could relate to this praise of vocal music. I mean, what does he say about Instrumentalmusik? He says it's the most romantic of the arts because only the infinite is its model, and I think that's. There's a mention of the same symphony in the Ombra Adorata story, and Hoffmann's relief that he's not going to hear it because he's in such a miserable, the narrator is in such a miserable state that to hear that instrumental music at this moment would just completely destroy him. And he's very glad that instead there's a really light, I think it's an overture, light movement from a piano concerto. That isn't going to detain him. So I suppose one thing to say is that you can map out a sort of ecology of music here that isn't simply pointing in a simple telos towards instrumental music, that isn't kind of discounting vocal music. Obviously, we have some purely instrumental compositions that don't detain Hoffmann very much at all. They're not trivial, they're not music, they're not the background music kind of model of instrumental music, but they definitely fall into the shadows in comparison with Italian vocal music like Ombra Adorata. So I think that Beethoven definitely epitomizes that function, that ability of music to model and to present an aesthetic object of the infinite to the listener, but it's not the kind of it's not the sort of be all and end all, just as Ombra Adorata isn't the be all and end all of transformative and transportative music. So I think that's how I would sort of start to answer that. There's the Kreisleriana could be seen as presenting a succession, a progression leading up to Beethoven's Instrumentalmusik, but I think that would be much too excessively sequential. And I think the treatment also of vocal music in something like Ritter Gluck, so that's Hoffmann's very direct evocation of the composer Gluck as a force that takes the listener pretty directly into the Geisterreich, into the world that he otherwise, and is pretty directly kind of overwhelming, transportative, all the things that the Beethoven Instrumentalmusik does. Ritter Gluck does very similar things, I think, in sketching out a narrative of the sublime that's based in vocal music. Does that, yeah, but I would be fascinated to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, I agree with you that it's not simply sequential, and that it's much more multifaceted than the frequent reference just to Beethoven's Instrumentalmusik would say, because Hoffmann at the same time, he himself composed a lot of vocal music, and he has time and again written about some of his fictional figures being transported into a romantic realm by a female singer. If you think of Julia in Kater Moor, and also of Rat Crespel's daughter, time and again, if you think historically, the discussion about what is primary harmony or melody, repeatedly Hoffmann seems to take the side of melody when he's talking about singing. And I was struck by looking at Ombra Adorata here, that he doesn't even mention the orchestra, he just concentrates on the voice. And I have no explanation for it, but I find it really fascinating that on the one hand, he himself has analyzed Beethoven's music structurally in such a sophisticated way. He writes in this sophisticated way, but he's also very much drawn to the simplicity of the human voice. So there's like a split in Hoffmann.
And I suppose another one of the other ways to think about that is that Hoffmann is so invested I think in the mode of the sublime, and the sublime itself is internally split between the kind of between the sublime of simplicity and the sublime of complexity, and that's already a kind of thematic running through music discourse by the time Hoffmann is writing. So that split between Gesang and Lied in the purely vocal tradition, or between complex polyphony and really, really simple paired back melodies are already two facets of the sublime that Hoffmann can draw on and conjure with.
Let's not forget that in Rat Crespel we have a situation where singing is life-threatening for the singer. Even that Hoffmann contemplates, so that we have this extraordinary tension even in the execution of art. And I think what you also pointed out so beautifully is the implicit performativity that of course we have in music, and that is something that he brings out in the way he writes also about the way in which an aria of this sort is performed. So any further questions, please? Any other thoughts? Yeah, Martin Swales, please.
I just wanted to add a footnote because I couldn't help thinking of it when you quote the it was the Stendhal or something, when if something goes wrong, you end up being lumbered and you're stuck in the box in an opera. And that is the central nexus in Hoffmann's wonderful story about Don Giovanni. And that sense that the reisende enthusiast arrives in this hotel, moves instantly into a box, and that is not a place of disenchantment. The music is already there, and he has this mystical meeting with Donna Anna, the singer performing Donna Anna, somebody else. And the only thing we know at the end is that the metaphysical reading that Donna Anna is exhausted by the meeting with Don Giovanni is borne out in the real world, because the singer died that night at 2 a.m. And I think it's a wonderful story that simply confirms your wonderful paper about both the metaphysics and the physics of what goes on in Hoffmann, in opera, in music, in performance, and in the repetition of performance. So thank you very much. Sorry, that wasn't a question, but I just enjoyed your paper greatly.
Oh, thank you so much. That's incredibly kind, and I think you're right. There's much more to do with the figure of the opera box and the position of the spectator or the listener in the opera box, and it's such a feature of musical writing in this period, and something again that makes vocal music such an interesting topic. You know, I didn't read out the passages from De Quincey, but he also sort of expatiates on the social and spatial experience of attending the opera, what it means to pay different amounts and to get dressed up in different ways and to stand in different places. And the opera box is obviously a kind of something that's elevated, often, not always, but often is signaling an elevated position in the theatre. It's enclosed and yet it's not completely cut off. It reminds me a little bit actually of Anne Radcliffe's kind of quite cunning use of little spots that sit in and yet stick out from a larger architectural space, and that give you a special vantage on a scene outside, and that could be used to suggest, you know, your special sublime vantage and access point, but that can also suggest a kind of morally dubious position of making yourself cut off, and I think that the opera house is a perfect place for people to explore that kind of morally ambivalent position, and also just to model what empirical experience looks like. You know, I think it's especially in Radcliffe, I think you can see, you could hope, wonder if you see just a model of the kind of you know, the subject in a place that is not seen but that can see, receiving impressions of all kinds from outside, and a kind of body model, a subject model in that position of the opera box would be fascinating to look at it also in Balzac's musical novellas, and further afield. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Fine. Are there any further questions? This doesn't seem to be the case. Well, in this case, I can simply echo what Martin has said already in praise of your lecture, Miranda. A splendid paper. Thank you ever so much. And it was also, ladies and gentlemen, the resounding finale, dare I say so, of this academic year's BASF Lecture Series of the Center for Anglo-German Cultural Relations. We will continue with a series in the autumn, in October, so watch this space. But for the time being, Miranda, once again, thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your morning. And ladies and gentlemen, enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you for attending, and all the very best to you all. Bye for now. Thank you.